to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Stephen Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined by Right Ruminations to discuss what does a community devoted to free speech actually look like. I was interested in this topic because there's been a lot of discussion about cancel culture and free speech, and then you have people claiming, "Oh no, we're for free speech, but we're for accountability culture. We're not for cancel culture because no one wants to support cancel culture because that's always considered bad." But I mean, the question really is, what do we mean by free speech, and why is free speech good, and how does it relate to how you deal with other people? So, I mean, some people will just hold sort of a thin view on free speech, that free speech, well, you can say what you wish, but you happen to live in, I don't know, for instance, if you happen to live in a condominium or a big sort of housing development created by a corporation which decides that, oh no, you can't advocate anarcho-syndicalism, and if you do, you'll get booted out. Some people say, well, that's fine, that's free speech, it's not the government coercing you. But then when do you get the situation where nobody will employ you, and if you say a certain thing, then you get the question, well, is that sort of verging on, well, I'm not trying to say that that's necessarily the same as sort of direct violent action, but that seems, even if they legally believe in sort of free speech as such, they don't. It seems to be a formal legal position rather than a more stronger held view that there's something about an individual being able to speak their mind with minimal legal or social repercussions. So I thought, well, who's a good guy to ask about this topic? It was Right Ruminations. You may have come across our debate on Todd Lewis's channel, Praise of Folly, a number of years ago, on anarcho-capitalism, and I made the argument that anarcho-capitalism was antithetical to free speech, and that was one of his major arguments against it. Now, we're going to park that for today, but what we want to talk about today, what is free speech and why is it valuable? So, all right, thanks for joining us. And so firstly, in your view, what would you consider free speech to be?
First of all, thank you for having me back. I think that freedom of speech should be viewed in terms of the kind of culture that it involves. It is true that there is not likely to ever be a completely thick view of freedom of speech implemented, simply because of human nature's rather conformist nature. I think that really what you have to ask yourself is a positive vision in mind when one is advocating freedom of speech. And I see that as a kind of culture that we've come closer to in, say, the past several decades than any society previously. That kind of begins with the Enlightenment. That you have people who are excited about new things, new ideas, where people want to debate the latest book, or they want to talk about the latest engaging film, where people do have their own ideas, where people do not always have to be on the same page morally. I mean, if you think of someone like Stephen Fry, for example, whom goodness knows I have many disagreements with, he's sort of, as a cultural character, embodies the image of a free speech society, that it's a fairly kind of modern, urbane way of that is maybe more transcendent than biological. So I kind of want to get away from the sort of systematic view of freedom of speech, where there's the question of, well, is it purely legal? How legal does it have to be? Or how far can the legal prohibitions on speech extend? Should it always be prohibited that a business bar someone on the basis of supporting something very controversial like pedophilia? I don't really think that that's feasible or possible, like just simply on the level of would it ever happen or not. So speech is as much a cultural phenomenon as it is a legal phenomenon, even though, of course, things like, say, the U.S. First Amendment are legal preconditions for that cultural social arrangement, if that begins to answer the question.
Yeah, that's getting there. So it's more of an overall culture and an approach to ideas and things more than set legal or social prohibitions. I think that's what I interpret you as saying. Why do you think free speech is valuable? Why is it something that a society should encourage?
I think that society should encourage it because if you look at the kinds of societies that have risen hand in glove with freedom of speech, that they are the same societies in which we've seen the rise of capitalism, of productivity, of various productions. I mean, just look at speech did at least begin to become freer when people even began to think of freedom of speech in the Enlightenment. I mean, this is the era in which we see the rise of much more sophisticated art forms like Bach and Handel. We see more refined and engaging philosophers like René Descartes, David Hume. And then, like in the 19th century, when it actually begins to intensify in practice, like unlike in the 18th century, you actually see some facsimile of freedom of speech emerge. The culture becomes even more saturated by something imaginative, transcendent. I mean, you have the music of Richard Wagner. You have philosophers like Nietzsche, even people who would rail against freedom of speech. I mean, that's kind of one of the is that, yes, you have, say, Catholic monarchists or neo-Nazis or whatever talking on the internet decrying freedom of speech, yet the whole cultural milieu in which they are participating is really one that does not exist without freedom of speech. Because were you in a society that did not value freedom of speech in any way, then if you were behaving like that, you would very quickly find yourself shut down. I think that all the idea of a free speech culture that goes hand in hand with a broader kind of expansive artistic and intellectual culture is emblematic. It is conducive toward the cultivation of the transcendent in humanity, so that it's not simply a matter of you have these herd animals who follow a set of moral rules and just sort of live purely within nature. I see the ability to engage in freedom of speech as part of man's conquest of nature. So it really is something that humans become more capable of as they become more cognizant of the transcendent in human nature in a very concrete kind of way.
So if I understand you correctly, free speech is valuable because it takes humanity away from a herd sort of mentality, and there is something about cultivating. There's a virtue in cultivating your own aesthetic, ethical views, which is a good in and of itself, irrespective of the content of the views held. And so the society should sort of strive for people to work it out and sort of figure out for themselves in a relativistic sense necessarily, but rather that needs to be done in addition to sort of being correct. Is that what you say? So because obviously one of the arguments against free speech is, well, should we allow error to spread? So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that we should the process of thought of the individual to come to particular conclusions, that process in and of itself is valuable. Would that be a fair summation of your position?
Well, not not necessarily irrespective of the conclusions. In order for the conclusions to develop in a desirable direction, some facilitation of those individuals who are ambitious enough to be pioneers in ideas. I mean, there are plenty of people whose contributions I would tend to view as more or less worthless, and I'm not sure that I'm in celebration of mediocrity. But I do think that among people who actually have something interesting to contribute, that you want to have a culture that facilitates those people. I certainly think it matters what direction they take this in, but I don't believe it's possible in the confines of a more traditional censorship-oriented view on speech. It's not irrespective. It's not necessarily conversation in general, or this kind of self-actualization in general that is desirable, but rather it's the pursuit of excellence. And I think as either the lowest common denominator or the existing establishment is allowed to set the parameters, then that's going to lead to a standard of mediocrity, and it's not going to allow society to develop in the way that I would like to see it develop. So it's really more about the pursuit of excellence rather than self-actualization.
Okay, so is free speech sort of analogous to competition then? That via sort of competition and the sort of clash of ideas, that the best and the most excellent ones will survive?
Well, it is analogous to competition, not necessarily that the best ideas will always survive, but almost that they won't even be able to put themselves forward as competitive if it is existing moral standards that really are going to kind of set the parameters for the discussion. It seems to me that that it's almost about competition in a more indirect sense. It's about the kinds of people who will have the opportunity to put themselves out there, to be made known as public presence, as having a public presence. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that yes, it is about competition, but not necessarily in the kind of very systematic, narrow, and technical way that say J.S. Mill would have used it. Not that I am against John Stuart Mill's defense of freedom of speech. I think that much that he says is correct, but I do want to make it clear that it goes beyond this kind of truism or platitude of "may the best idea win." It's about rather more than that.
So in a sort of an ideal, relatively ideal society devoted to sort of free speech, what kind of institutions and what kind of sort of organizations do you think would arise in the society, and what would it sort of look like? How would it say? I mean, a good contrast maybe for today. You know, how would a free speech society differ from the one we currently have? Or do you think we do actually have free speech today as a genuine sort of free speech society?
I would see freedom of speech in this sense as something that we are losing. So we may have it compared to other societies, but at the same time, its decline seems to be obvious. I would say that universities would certainly look different. That if you look at both conservative and leftist universities, of course, most of them are leftist now, but even their conservative competition, there is a sense in which the college culture, for example, is no longer in any way a place where people come to learn to be adults. And I do not mean that in the Jordan Peterson sense of getting jobs and getting married. and this kind of very it's a wonderful life template of what it is to be an adult. But I mean, where they come to actually like talk about careers and to mark on the world and to solidify, develop their worldviews, to have sort of a better sense of mastery over reality. Whereas instead, it seems as though on both left and right, academic environments have become places of almost sort of juvenile conformity. I mean, it's not even a sort of necessary pragmatic conformity, but it almost seems to be a sort of very, very underdeveloped, childish sort of moral conformity, a sense of, this makes me a good person. So there's just no sense of nuance. There's no sense of professionalism. There's no sense of really valuing the cultivation of excellence. So I think that certainly academic culture would look much more robust and really would be able to operate as a profession, more so than a kind of finishing daycare school. I also think that that publishing would be that there's the written word. I mean, if you look at what reactionaries say, if you think of the like the dissident right, like the more radical nationalistic elements of the dissident right, say 4 years ago, they were always railing against books. I mean, they would call the fixation with learning autistic. They would say, that people who are too interested, I don't know, in Tesla or English history or something are really just not sufficiently manly, that we rely too much on books and the written word and have this kind of fetish for it. And you see the same kind of contempt for, say, great books or Western civilization with the left. So I think that a kind of re-enchantment with the printed word, with the idea that books are kind of like unlikely luxury for which we should be very grateful. It plays a large part in what a free speech society would look like. I mean, aside from the press and the universities, the academic world, I think that the arts in general would do well to move away from focusing on these kind of didactic moral statements on everything, which really has a tendency to make the arts ugly. It makes them inferior. When you think of some of the sort of most enchanting fiction, I mean, if you take Tolkien, for example, with the Lord of the Rings and his other works of fiction, I mean, one of the things that makes them so enjoyable is that they don't have an obvious didactic moral lesson, that they kind of are able to stand as works of excellence, of transcendence. So I think that the arts would certainly be a third beneficiary of a free speech society, and something facilitated by a free speech society, in that they would be able to kind of, without having to necessarily be facilitators for whatever the kind of latest moral standard of the iconoclastic frenzy is.
How would so from what I'm getting from you, a lot of your focus is on speaking with the university that should pursue excellence, and it's just some sort of just a credentialized organization, and it should be going for excellence in all manners, and it should really be a genuine sort of elite institution, which it no longer is. I think that's a broadly fair statement. What I'm interested in with respect to free speech, however, though, is how would the free speech society deal with the heretic? So a lot of the, and by heretic, I'm using a very broad sense to anybody who is sufficiently at odds with a particular widely held orthodoxy. How can you deal with them? And how? how does this sort of go with the free speech society? So, something like a university, for instance, can there be particular as it were, methodological standards that you can hold your faculty to in their published work or their speakings? We'll ignore their personal conduct, that you think would be reasonable to remove them from the position of. So for instance, would it be reasonable in your view to fire, say, Peter Singer for arguing that infanticide is in principle fine if the parents don't care, up to the age of 6 months, if I remember correctly? Or do you think that any sort of academically held, reasoned position should be sort of promoted within, be tolerated, as it were, in a genuine sort of historic sense in the university, and that should be able to be continued, and that should be fine, and there should be no problem for tenure or anything like that? Or do you think there are certain things that, whilst we want to pursue excellence, because excellence is the goal rather than just individual self-actualization, there is a place for excluding the heretics somehow? And on a more general point, how do you think what people say and believe ought to influence everyday behavior? So, for instance, could you ostracize someone who advocated for infanticide? Would that be something consistent with freedom of speech, such that very few people would do business with him, for instance? Would that be something you think would be consistent with the free speech society? And how do you sort of cut the cake, as it were?
Well, because the freedom of speech society is a phenomenon as opposed to an abstract system, that is, it's something that I actually want to see exist, that it absolutely, whether it should or not, will have some equivalent of dealing with the heretic, with he who is outside of the bounds of what is commonly held to be appropriate, morally acceptable. I'm sort of less interested in what is a heresy at any given time, and simply more at how those things are dealt with, given that it is inevitable that there are certain opinions that simply will not be tolerated by a society, even if what those are changes. I think that, first of all, they should not be dealt with legally, generally, if they are ideological issues. So, of course, say they're enemies of the state, I think that they can be, who are disclosing privileged information, and I'm not talking about any particular examples, truly, but simply, running the state does require a certain degree of what you might call administrative censorship. However, when you're talking about ideological censorship, that's when I have a problem with it. And I think that some version of the United States First Amendment is really the best example of freedom of speech in concrete terms looks like, or that is the most concrete precondition for freedom of speech, is some kind of separation of state and ideological speech, because then even if you have other states that do not have a First Amendment, it does serve as an example to those places. It sets the ideological tenor of society. It gives people an example of what freedom of speech looks like. It I think resonates with a lot of people as a reasonable arrangement. Okay, I will have to follow the physical laws as they are passed. There may be taxes, there may be zoning laws, there may be trade laws, maybe regulations on any number of things, but there is this kind of safe zone of, but I will, what I think about the given arrangement, I will be able to contribute to the formation in some small way of what those arrangements look like. In terms of enforcement in extra legal ways, like say with a university administration. I think that what is important is that the inevitable reliance on ostracization of social shunning of maybe people being in danger of being terminated, I think was your example. What is important is that those be mitigated by an underlying cultural desire for excellence over moral signaling. So a cultural issue than a legal issue, in that there needs to be an advocacy for the a pursuit of excellence over iconoclasm. I think that's what's most important. Yes, it's inevitable that you have professional restrictions on what the ideological order of a given institution is. Where that becomes a problem is when it ceases to be a kind of reasonable professional standard and becomes, as I said, iconoclastic. Really, what it comes down to, I think, is in law, separation of state and ideological speech, and then in the world, in the private sector, a strong distaste for moral iconoclasm, which elevates sort of the which really elevates this kind of knee-jerk moralism above anything productive or nuanced or interesting. That would seem to be the qualitative key, is the opposition to iconoclasm.
I'm going to ask you a question here. I don't know. Could it be that free speech is just somewhat fragile insofar as the general inclination is no one actually wants free speech? I mean, everyone's fine with, as the cliche goes, everyone's fine with free speech that they agree with, but no one's fine with free speech they don't agree with. So one of the reasons why the topic, I think, is something like ANCAPs are against free speech, which go back to your debate here. And one of the reasons why I'm an anarchist is I don't think the state is neutral. I actually think the state is quite mediocre here. Your pursuit of excellence point, I would say the state gets more in the way here. I don't think the state is, like, I agree with the sort of, ironically, I agree with the far left and the far right on these questions here, and so far as the state isn't just some, bumbling, like, neutral judge here. So I don't know. So maybe it's just a sort of particular time and place based on technology here that has just passed here. And now that Zuckerberg and the CIA and various other organizations can control the internet in some ways, it'll just die off. So maybe it's just material things that happen. It's not really a culture thing. Or it could be the state, of course, that's controlling it. So my question here is, like, you said that free speech is declining. When was it good? When did we have a good free speech culture? Because people on the left and the right will point out that Lincoln, basically shut down the press. Anyone who went, I think Tom Lorenzo's book, The Real Lincoln, points out that, like, throughout the Civil War, you can't really send any. It would shut down Baltimore newspapers. It's the same way in Woodrow Wilson, World War I. I presume similar things happen in other countries. Actually, no, similar things happen in other countries too. And actually, the West was probably arguably U.S. West was probably one of the freest ones, which is maybe an argument in favor of it, or it's an argument against it in a way too. We've never really had free speech. What you said, it's been in decline. When was it good? And then what made the decline? If I should ask a concrete question here, I mean, that'd be my concrete question, because the anarchists would say we might never have had it. It might be a future thing or something like that.
In absolute terms, I simply think that, say, for the past 200 years, it became more present than it ever was in any other time in history. So it was good only in a relative sense. I would agree with the anarcho-capitalists who support a free speech culture that it is something of the future. I mean, an analogy would be with how Ayn Rand thought about capitalism. I mean, you could say, yes, she thought that when capitalism was probably for about 200 years maybe before the New Deal, something like that, but ultimately something whose development ideally would be in the future. So it's an ideal that is only ever present relative to its absence in times prior. So I would say probably the past 2 centuries, even now, compared to what it normally is, I think that we have an advantage with respect to freedom of speech. Its decline has been, I think, sort of, I don't know, almost a post-millennial thing, sort of like since the, I suppose the seeds of it are planted around the turn of the millennium. I mean, obviously there are factors from before that contribute to the degradation of freedom of speech, but it does seem to be something, say, in the last 20 years, and certainly the last 5-6 years, that in decline has become more tactile, tangible. That you are also correct that the state is not a neutral actor that is just has ever just sort of defended ideas or been indifferent to public discourse. My view is only that the state is a precondition for some kind of institutional neutrality. I not to go based on previous discussions that I've had publicly, that power in a sense is a precondition for freedom. So it's not that the state is neutral, but the state kind of sort of provides the groundwork for private actors then to engage freely. I mean, it's almost like a kind of a baseline foundation, because I think that human beings by nature are not, the average human is not very apt to tolerate like excellence or freedom in society. So that you do have to have the state to kind of create society in a sense, in the modern sense of society. That is, you need the state, but that at the same time that force, that power of that institution then can become a hindrance if it continues to, if the sort of the foundation becomes more important than the thing that the top of it, which I guess would be modern, sophisticated, developed human existence.
How would you think? I mean, this is slightly off. Actually, no, I'll go to this first. So, if you had a free speech, what I'm thinking is, if you had like universities in sort of a broadly more free speech orientated society, irrespective of whether you should ostracize these people or whatever, I think well, I would imagine that you would have universities which would be would almost seek out the best heretics, the best people who advocate for wildly contrary positions, and encourage public debates with them. I think one of the manifold problems of a modern university is it's rather insular and doesn't seem to want to encourage thought and sort of development in sort of society in general. It sort of just talks to itself to a large extent. And you get the universities cancelling certain cancel culture. They stop various speakers coming in under various guises. I mean, that would seem to be entirely antithetical. So, I mean, I would imagine in my sort of idealized view, even if you were to have like I think it's fine for you to have like a Protestant university, and if you're not a Protestant, you move away from, I don't know, the Westminster Confession or something, you're fired, fine. But if you want to sort of like engage like a Catholic or an atheist or an Orthodox or whatever in sort of like a public discourse in the best sort of and try to deal with the most sophisticated arguments from the other side, I think that would be at least a sign that, you know, free speech and excellence is sort of valued. Would that be something you would generally advocate, and do you think that would be a good sign of a society that is sort of moving in the sort of the free speech culture direction?
Yes, I would. About the ambition of those who produce insular works of excellence, even though that is what I prioritize. At the same time, I take the point. I mean, in order for academics to do their jobs well, they have to be sharpened by contrary opinion. It just seems to me that to be a mature intellectual is by nature to deal with questions that are, or to deal with positions that are the opposite of your own. That if you cannot do that, really doing your job as an intellectual, and if the intellectuals in society are not competent, they're not doing their job, then that overall is not really indicative of a developed, competent society. And furthermore, I think you're correct that it's indicative of an absence of a freedom of speech society. As an indicator, I think that's perfectly reasonable as a kind of litmus test of, is there a approximation of the free speech ideal? Yes, do academics deal with serious contrary positions? Is there genuine academic competition where positions that are unpopular in academia are given a fair hearing so that they can be dealt with successfully or otherwise?
Yes. So what do you think about the public nature? Do you think that universities should have like a public version of these sort of debates and discussions, or do you think it's perfectly fine for it to be sort of within the university? Because one of my ideas would be that you know, it's sort of open to the public, but at least recorded or something, that, you know, this can be seen as, and so then the public as a whole gets an idea of, you know, different perspectives and will be able to see the relative merits of either position. Do you think something the university should have some sort of public aspect like that, or would you think it would be okay just for it to be sort of internal?
I certainly think it should have a public component. I think that it's not, if it is simply behind the scenes, then it becomes this kind of like intellectual masturbation where it just is sort of done for the sake of almost the entertainment of the intellectuals. I don't really know what the point of that is, unless you're talking about, say, indirectly influencing public policy tanks or to legislators or something like that. But really, since that's not exactly how academic culture operates in practice anyway, it operates through the kind of trickling down of opinions through students, the formation of students, how those people then go and populate various institutions in society. I don't really see why for it to be insular. Maybe there are some issues that are simply so sensitive that maybe should be reserved as kind of these esoteric proposals that maybe, you know, are only passed on to legislators or to businessmen or what have you. But by and large, I think that the real danger there is simply in having the academia become a sort of arena of simple idea play, and not actually a place that has any pragmatic investment in having an influence on the world. I would be in favor of a public component for sure.
Moving away from university and sort of the pursuit of excellence there, how would you think employers in a free speech society outside the academic realm would deal with things? So there's various stories, as you're probably aware of. Well, there was one guy who's worked for a supermarket and put a video up. It was on YouTube complaining about Indian customers because they were hard work and kept wanting discounts all the time. And then the supermarket fired him. What would you think the sort of free speech society? What do you think the relationship between sort of, as it were, private individual speech and how that should ideally impact how you're sort of viewed by your employer for continuing sort of employment? Or do you think it's perfectly reasonable to have, as it were, outside of work speech codes, effectively, which if you breach, you then could be fired? And when I say reasonable, I mean this is something that'd be generally sort of held, not like maybe part of a seminary or something like that. You're just working in, I don't know, some sort of corporation dealing in, I don't know, selling cheese or something. How do you think a genuine free speech society would deal with issues like that?
I think that this might be more of a qualitative problem than a quantitative one. So when your issue, surely to some extent, is freedom of speech, in that, yes, I don't really think it's reasonable or sane for the employer, the company, to be breathing down the necks of, say, construction workers or a grocery store stock people. But nevertheless, I think that this problem is more the result of the type of ideology that's in vogue right now, more so than of whether businesses should be allowed to do this or not. I think it's inevitable that there will be some kind of institutional enforcement just for PR purposes. But it's just the nature of the things are so juvenile, complaining about customers or someone tweeted something, some construction worker, some grocery store employee, receptionist, someone who no one cares about. No one cares about their opinion. A kind of juvenile sort of just worship of pettiness that seems to pervade so much these days. That is the real problem. Insofar as it is quantitative, how much should they be involved in the everyday lives of employees with respect to what they say? I really think that is something that has to be dealt with on the qualitative level. If you have this ideology that is about the elevation of mediocrity, that is ostensibly egalitarian, that wants this kind of reevaluation of standards, then you're going to have businesses treating people like it's daycare. You're going to have this kind of very school marmish culture of, you cannot say that. That's not very nice. It's really this. It's in a weird way. It's almost more of an aesthetic problem. It is like that the institutions have not gone beyond a kind of elementary level of like civics class or something. If that makes any sense, it's really more of an ideological issue than a legal issue, and I think that's certainly an ideology that absolutely needs to be destroyed.
No, I certainly agree that the current way of going about it is ridiculous in the extreme. And it was, in the example I gave, it's perfectly obvious that the guy who worked for the store was not representing the company in any way. He did stupidly leave his T-shirt on from the company. I would add that. But there was absolutely no chance that anybody actually thought that this is what the supermarket in question actually believed. So it's the issue. I think the way, and I don't know exactly how to circumscribe it. There seems to be, you have to have a logical connection between the type of work they're doing and what they're saying. So, for instance, if what they're saying basically has a zero relevance to the job that they're doing, well, effectively, you should just ignore it, even if you think it's wrong. I mean, yeah, what has construction work got to do? Well, I was going to say anarcho-syndicalism, but I suppose you could argue that. But I mean, it's most of the stuff is so far removed from what they're actually doing. And if they're a decent employee and they're pleasant and, they do their job, I mean, it just seems perverse and small-minded to fire them. Now, if it was the case that you have a job which is more, how should you say, ideological in a sense, that is, what their job is to propagate particular ideas, then, this is something that you would or should take into account. So, for instance, if you have a bishop, it was famously it was the Bishop of Durham prior to Tom Wright, who didn't believe in the physical resurrection of Christ and went on record as saying that he believed in spiritual resurrection. I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty sure this is like not what you should do if you're a bishop. That would seem sort of perfectly reasonable to, go, hang on. No, you can't go about saying that if you're the bishop. Well, actually, to be fair, if you got that position anyway, you've made a mistake, whoever hired him. So I think the way that we can attempt to go around this is to sort of circumscribe what the work is about. That said, then you could get somewhat creative and say, well, I am a Jewish only business. And then we only hire Jews. It's like, well, but being Jewish isn't necessarily related to what you're doing. Now, I know this is like not speech, but sort of being, as it were. And then going down line going down is kind of going down some of the arguments used in sort of like the anti-discrimination legislation, which is like, well, it's a pub. It doesn't matter who turns up in the pub. It's like, well, it kind of does, depending on the atmosphere and various things. So that's my reticence to some extent of necessarily advocating the relationship between the job and the speech outside the job. But I think that's probably the way that makes the most sense. Do you have any comments on my sort of general approach as to how you determine what speech outside the job kind of is sort of sanctionable and which isn't?
I think that you're absolutely correct, that it should be judged by the relevance to the position. In terms of, in a pragmatic sense, what it is that you're trying to do. If you have a bishop and he's not teaching the doctrines of his given denomination, then that sort of defeats the point of having a bishop. If you have clientele going into a bar who are really disruptive to the kind of atmosphere you're trying to create, per se a problem to have them there that is relevant to your institution. If you have a professor, let's say, who advocates something as unpopular as pedophilia, and then like all your donors start pulling, your funding dries up, no one wants to come to your institution, then that's kind of a problem per se for the thing that you are trying to do, which is to accomplish some kind of a tangible good. That seems to me to be a reasonable arrangement. That is the reasonable control of this private sector kind on what is allowed to be said publicly and isn't. It just doesn't have anything to do with what you're trying to do. Like, is it in any way relevant, or are you just showing off?
No, I think that's I think that's fair. Oh, on a more pragmatic level, what's your view how social media should go about policing themselves? As you may be aware, lots of people have been kicked off Twitter or other places for disinformation recently, which is otherwise known as saying things opposite to the CDC, amongst others. If you were to have, say, a social media site as such, what would you think would be sort of reasonable policies to to hold on there. I mean, so typically people don't say, oh yeah, the social media sites should allow lots of hardcore pornography and videos, jihadi videos of beheadings, for instance. So where would you go at if you were sort of like a social media, if you were Mark Zuckerberg, for instance? What approach do you think you would have to sort of monitoring content on Facebook, for instance, or other such channels?
I guess a practical way of, or a simple way of doing that would be to distinguish between opinions and actions. So there's some speech that is more like an action than an opinion. So if you're disclosing private information about someone, or you're posting a video where there are participants dealing in something, let's say non-consensual, or is violent, or is illegal, then maybe your underlying opinion that it was a good idea to post those things should be permitted. But there's also an action involved. If you are just slandering someone and calling them names, well, there's a sense in which that almost lies more in the realm of behavior than it does in any kind of exchange of ideas. Now, I don't want the state to look at it that way, because I think that'd be too convenient for the state to find ways of censoring whatever it wanted. But for a private company, I think sort of making a distinction between speech as action, as an extension of action, and then speech per se as a communication of opinion might be a reasonable place to draw the line, as at least a rough guideline.
That's fair. I mean, I ran a forum for a time, and my view was, well, as long as it was just ideas and it wasn't personal, then, it was fine. I think I cut down on swearing and other stuff like that. But I was very much like, I'm not going to send. Now, I suppose you could argue that the form is content in a sense, but I tried very much to have a position that, I mean, it didn't really need to do much moderation because the type of people on there anyway. But I was very much of the view that, in at least in a pragmatic sense, we can make a distinction between form and content. And what I wasn't trying to censor was content; it was form rather than content. That was the way I attempted to go. But interesting with Facebook, they've now seen a drop in their user base recently, and their shares have fallen. So their recent editorial decisions may or may not have been good for business. We're nearing the hour now. So, have you any final thoughts on the free speech topic and how it relates to society as a whole?
Well, I'll finish by thanking you again for having me on. It's good to be back, and say that I think that freedom of speech is part and partial with the development of a healthy, robust society. I think that it's kind of miraculous that it even ever did develop as far as it has, and that we ought to appreciate what we have while we still have any lasting residue of it, before we let that particular social advantage completely fall away from us. I would rather live in the kind of society that at least pretends to have freedom of speech, rather than live in the kind of society that openly parades itself as pro-censorship, because I think we can just see empirically what that kind of society looks like, and I certainly have no desire to live in that kind of society.
Thank you for joining us again, Right Ruminations. I'd just now like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibernetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibernetyshow@gmail.com.